My name is Morten and you are watching Frost Astrophotography. Welcome to PixInsight tutorial part 1, Pre-processing image calibration. Before we get started, I want to show you some tips on arranging your files and your PixInsight workspace. I usually use a number of processes often, and I also would like to have those as processing icons on my desktop for easy access and convenience. If you right click and select processing icons, you can load a defined set of processing icons that you have stored. This will enable you to easily access not only a commonly used process, but also the configuration of that process. To put something on the desktop here, you just open up a process, anything at all, let's say image calibration, for example. You can make your adjustments, whatever you would like. And when you have finished with making your settings, you drag this little new instance triangle to your desktop and you name it with something familiar. Calibrate my frames. And of course you can't have any spaces, my bad. Like that. You can now place this icon wherever you like it up here, and when you have finished, you just right click on that space, select process icons and save process icons. And then the next time you have it, you load your icons and you're all set to start working. The next thing I want to talk about is arranging your files. Let me open up the Explorer, and also in advance apologize for this window being in Swedish, since my operating system is in Swedish, but I think you will understand it anyway. So I normally have a file for my project or my imaging session. Sometimes I do imaging sessions over several different nights. Then I usually do one folder for each night and calibrate those files. And then if I'm going to do a project that is over several sessions or nights, I usually move or copy my calibrated frames into that folder before moving on to step 2, which is image approval and integration. We'll talk about this in the next part of this tutorial. My tip is to make a directory for your dark flats. You might not be using dark flats. I do, since I have a dedicated Astro camera. And I'm not using bias frames, but you might be using bias frames instead. I also have my dark frames. I have a library of dark frames. Again, the advantage of having a dedicated cooled Astro camera is that I can, for the different types of gain I use, I can make a library of dark frames, since I always use the same temperature setting on my camera, or at least I have a couple or maybe 3 different settings depending on the ambient temperature outside. So I have dark frames library here. You can see I have darks with the same temperature for different gains and exposure times. So I have for 10 seconds up to 300 seconds here for -10 and one for -15. The next folder that I use is the folder for the flat frames. Now, since this project is a mono project and I have light frames for H-alpha, oxygen 3 and sulfur 2, I also have flat frames for each of these filters. So I have 30 flats for H-alpha, 30 flats for O3, and 30 flats for sulfur 2. And I also have them taken at the exact same temperature, even though that might not be necessary. Why gamble, I would say, if you already have a cooled camera. And to be extra sure, I also match the focus point, of course, or the focus position for each of the filters. So the flat for H-alpha here is at focus position exactly the same as the light frames taken with H-alpha. And then of course we have the folder with our light frames, and you can see I have H-alpha light frames, O3 light frames, and sulfur 2 light frames. To make it easier, I also configure my acquisition software to include details like light, the object, the type of filter, the bin mode, the gain, the offset, the exposure time, and the focus position and the temperature. Just so I'm in a convenient way have all of that information in the file name. I like that a lot. Then I have a processing folder, and I will talk about that in part 3 and 4 of this tutorial, where we go to the processing stages for a linear and a non-linear processing. I like to save copies of files during that process. The first step in this first part is to integrate your dark frames. Now, you might already have done this because, like I said, if you, like me, have a library of your dark frames, I would suggest also keep an up-to-date integrated master dark frame of those frames, so you don't have to do that every time you're making an image or a project. But I'm going through all steps here in this video, and I will show you everything you need to know. You might also wonder why I'm opening this now instead of the script weighted batch pre-processing that everyone talks about. And of course, you can use this script that will automate basically all the steps that I'm going to show you now, aside from maybe the image approval steps. But I actually want to have complete control over the process, and I also want to learn as I go along. So I've basically ended up with doing the steps manually, and I enjoy it doing that way. So I think it's good that you know the basics, and when you know that, you can, if you want to, use the weighted batch pre-processing script. So for all image integration purposes, we are using the process called image integration. You can access that on your processing menu tab and image integration, of course. I have already configured mine, so we're going to go through the configuration steps here. So nothing in the first section. In the second section, it is important that you have specific integration settings suitable for a dark frame. So for combination method, you would have to choose average. You don't want any normalization on these frames. You don't care about any weight of the frames, like we do later on when we integrate light frames, for example. And I'm sticking with the scale estimator, median absolute deviation from the median, or MAD. I'm not exactly sure now what the default settings are here, but I want to generate an integrated image, and I'm keeping this automatic buffer size selected. For these settings of pixel rejection, I want to use the linear fit clipping setting. You could use other settings if you have a lower number of dark frames. Winsorized sigma clipping, for example, if you have fewer, but since I recommend taking 30 dark frames at least, I believe that the linear fit clipping rejection algorithm is a good selection here. Again, no normalization. The rest of the settings, I believe, are default. You can double check that and copy mine. Might want to play with these settings if you want. I use a value of 5 for fit low, a value of 4 for fit high. I believe that is close to the default. No settings for the pixel rejection 3, and no changes for the rest of these settings. So the next step is basically to click on add files. Then you go to your folder, you go to your dark frames, and you select all of your frames. You double check that you have the frames here. As you can see, I used 40 frames for these dark frames, but when I take flats and dark flats, now I settle for 30 frames because I think that is enough. And then you basically are done. You don't have to do any other configuration other than clicking on the apply global setting and letting the process work. So when the process has completed, you will end up with a number of files here, rejection files, but you can close all of these because you don't actually need them. And you have the final integrated file. You can do a screen transfer function on that if you want to reveal the content. And as you can see here, since I'm using the ASI294MM Pro, I have a lot of ambient glow here. Amp glow, I would say. Yeah. Anyway, save as. You open the folder that we are working in, and I usually place that in the root folder. I want to save it as an XISF file, the native file of PixInsight. I call it the master dark. Like that. And we can close that. The next step is to integrate your dark flat frames. Now the dark flat frames are going to be used to calibrate your flat frames. Your flat frames are then going to be used to calibrate your light frames. So when you have actually calibrated your flat frames, you don't actually need your dark flat frames or your integrated dark flat frames anymore. But since hard drive disk space is fairly cheap these days, at the moment I'm keeping everything, and in the future I will see what I discard and delete and what I keep. Just as with the dark frames, the dark flat frames use the exact same process, image integration, and I have exactly the same settings, an average combination with no normalization. We don't care about the weights, and we use MAD for scale estimator. We use a linear fit clipping rejection algorithm, and we use no normalization. Now, since I'm not taking any chances, I actually take dark flat frames specifically for each filter, since I take flat frames for each filter. So in this section, or for this part, I need to make 3 master dark flat frames, 1 for each filter. There are others out there that say that you can use 1 dark flat for everything and also 1 flat for all the filters, but I would say if you have the time and ability and opportunity, just take 1 flat frame or 30 flat frames for each filter, and then 30 dark flats for each filter. So I'm beginning with my HA here, selecting those. I'm counting 30 of them, and they are all H alpha. And then I click on my apply global. So exactly the same as for the dark frames, I will discard of that. You can look at that. And then we save it as a master dark flat for HA. Okay. I clear. I click on add files again. I will select my O3. Make sure that there are 30 here, and then click on the apply global. Same procedure for this filter. Discard all the rejections, and we look at the file. Seems okay, and I save it as a master dark flat 03. Okay, close that. Now we clear this list one more time, and we scroll down to the S2, and then we click on the apply global. And the same procedure for this final filter. It looks good. Save as master dark flat S2. So now we have our dark flat frames, 1 master dark flat frame for each filter. The next step is to calibrate our flat frames. And like I said, I have a number of flat frames, 30 to be exact, for each filter. And that is mainly because the focus position changes, for me at least, between the filters. So there's a theoretical possibility that there might be a shift in dust motes or other contaminants inside my optical train or optical assembly when changing filters. And there also might be different dust specks or material on each filter, and that's why I do it for each filter. For this, we're going to use the process called image calibration, and like before, I have a configured set or instance of this already made on my workspace here. Now, since I'm doing my images in mono, if you're doing this in color, you might not be using different filters, and you would also need to enable the CFA here and choose your mosaic pattern to be able to process your color images. First of all, you will have to configure an output directory. Now, I've made a generic directory here that I normally use for processing my images. So here I have a first folder called calibrated flats, since those are created in this step. Later on, we're going to calibrate our lights, and in one of the final steps, we're also going to register our lights, and that means aligning the stars in each of your light frames. So there are 3 working directories that is needed for the entire processing process, so to speak. I keep those in exactly the same place, and I also empty those folders between each session. I usually, like I said in the beginning, keep my calibrated lights for each session, and that enables me to easily reuse them in larger projects without having to go through the first pre-processing steps again. Okay, minimizing that, going back to our image calibration. And here you select your output directory. In my case, it is the same output directory, so I don't have to worry about it. I don't want any signal evaluation or noise evaluation. I don't change any input pedestal settings. I don't select any overscan. I don't have a master bias frame at this point, since I don't use that. Instead, I'm using a master dark, and now this is where you need to keep your different dark frames separate. This relates to the master dark flat that we created in the previous step. It does not relate to the global master dark file that we created in the first step. That file is actually going to be used to calibrate our light frames later on. Now we're calibrating our flat frames, and for that we're going to use the master dark flat frame for each filter. So click on the folder, click on your folder for your project or session, open your master dark flat HA, click on add files, go to your flat frames folder, open up your flats for HA. Make sure that there are only HA flats and that you have your correct amount, in my case 30. Now you might wonder why I don't select calibrate. That is because I use exactly the same settings. The same exposure, the same gain, the same focus point, the same temperature. Everything is the same, and that means I don't need or want any calibration whatsoever. I don't want any optimization whatsoever. I just want to calibrate my flat with the master dark flat file. That is all I want to do. So when that is completed here, I will click on the apply global and it will run through the calibration process. Now this should be a fairly quick operation if you don't have a very slow computer. And when it has completed, we're going to check our folder. In this folder you'll find 30 flat frames, and it has a new amendment to the file name, which is _C. That stands for calibrated in the PixInsight world. Continuing on, clear that list. Make sure you're in your flat frames folder. I've also, you can see here on the file name, it's a capital F for the flat frames, so it's easily identifiable. Add those 30. Make sure that you change your master dark to your master dark flat 03. 03 flats, 03 master dark flat, and apply global. So when that is finished, we're checking our folder. Yes, we have 30 new frames there, 60 in total. We clear the list, we add files, we go to our flat frames folder and we add our last 30 S2 flats, 30 of them. And we select the master dark flat S2 and then click on the apply global. And when that is finished, we check the folder one more time, and now we have 90 objects in there, so that is finished. The next step here now is to do exactly what we did with the dark flat frames, but since we now have calibrated our flat frames, we will need to integrate the flat frames into a master flat. And that, of course, just like the dark flat frames, one for each filter, and we are going to use those in the next step when we calibrate our light frames, and that, of course, we have light frames for each filter as well. We open up our image integration one more time, but now you will see a difference in configuration because these are not dark frames anymore. These are flat frames, and we want to process these in a different way. First of all, we click on Add Files, and what you are going to do now is to open up the calibrated flats that you made in the earlier step. So we open up our first calibrated HA flats. Make sure that we have 30 of them. Yes, they are all there. And since we're dealing with flat frames now, we want to have a combination method of average. We want to have a multiplicative normalization. If you let your mouse hover over this, you will see that you have an explanation, and you can see that A multiplicative normalization should be used to integrate images that are to be further combined or applied by multiplication or division, such as flat fields. So I'm sure there are a lot of YouTube videos out there explaining all the settings in detail, but I'm not going to go into that in this video. So average combination, multiplicative, don't care about the weights. They are all the same in this. Scale estimator, I'm using the BWMV. And we want to generate an integrated image as before. For the pixel rejection, I'm still using linear fit clipping. For the normalization, I would like to have equalize fluxes. If you do similar as before and read, you can see that equalize fluxes simply matches the main histogram peaks of all images prior to pixel rejection. I'm not changing anything on pixel rejection 2, 3 or large scale, or use any region of interest here. So all of the other settings I'll keep at default. So when I'm finished with that configuration, I click on the Apply Global. When that is finished, I can close up these and I have my integrated flat file. I can stretch that if I want to. You can see here now this is super stretched, and that is why it looks like this. You can see that I have a dust mote here, probably on my filter, in my filter wheel, something here, maybe. Save as. I want to save that as a master flat HA. Clear that, add files, go into my calibrated flats again. I will select all my 03 calibrated flats, make sure I have 30, make sure that they are only 03, and don't change any settings, and apply global. When that is finished as well, I'm discarding the rejections. You can see that this is a perfectly gray flat. If I super stretch it, you will see I also have some dust inside this filter or on the filter. Now this is a 03 master flat 03. And the third time clear, add files, calibrated flats. Select all my S2 flats, make sure they are 30, and then apply global. And when that is finished, close the rejected files. We have a flat frame, we can super stretch that and also see that we have some dust in this. And then save it as a master flat S2. Now we're finished with this step. We can close that. The next step is to calibrate our light frames, and for that we use image calibration. Just as we did with the calibrate flat frames, but in this case we are going to calibrate our light frames. Now for this we need a new output directory like I showed you earlier. Instead of a calibrated flats, where we have all our flat frames calibrated, we have a folder that I called Calibrated Lights. And I always use the same to make it simple. And again, if you're doing a color calibration here, you're going to have to select that and choose your CFA mosaic pattern here. Regarding the settings here now, we need to be detailed and keep this correct. First, we add the files. For that, we're going into our project folder. In this case, you can see it's the Caldwell 49. We go into our light frames folder. We are selecting our first filter, light frames, and that is HA. Make sure that you only have that. I have 41 light frames taken. Now this is where it gets interesting. Like I said before, now you are going to select and open up a master dark frame. In this case, you're not going to use the master dark flats whatsoever, because those have played out their role. We have used those to calibrate our flats, and we have then integrated our flats into master flat files. So the master dark flat files and all the dark flat files, flat frames files, will not be used anymore in this project. When we're talking about a master dark for calibrating our light frames, we're going to use the global master dark, the master dark that is in synchronization with your light frames in regards of exposure time, gain, temperature. So we're selecting our global master dark file, and like I said earlier, you might have a library of those already if you have a cooled Astro camera like me. If you have a DSLR, you might also have a dark library. I also have a dark library for my DSLR that I collected during imaging sessions in different temperatures, just to be able to reuse those later on. But it's much harder since the temperature changes during your imaging session. So we have our master dark, the global master dark file, and we want to select the master flat file. So this is the file we made in the previous step. So master flat HA. Master dark, global, master flat HA for the HA filter. The light frames are the light frames for the HA filter. And no other configuration. We don't want any calibration or optimization for any of these. And then we click on the Apply Global. So this should be a fairly quick procedure. Check your calibrated lights folder. I have 41 files here, and that is correct. They also have the _C in the file name now. That stands for calibrated. You can change that in your postfix here if you want any other designation. Clear this, add files, go into your light frames again, select all your O3 or other. Make sure that you only have the same filter. In this case, I only have 25. We're going to use the same master dark for all of the light frames. That is because I use the same gain, bin, and exposure times, and I also have the exact same temperature for all of my light frames. But for the master flat, I'm going to change that to my master flat for O3. So O3 light frames, O3 master flat frame, and apply global. That is finished. We can double check our directory here, and we see that I have my O3 here as well. They are calibrated. We clear this list one more time. We go into our light frame folder and we select our S2 light frames. They are all S2. I have 25 of them. Again, the same master dark file, but I switch out the master flat or the master flat S2, since I have S2 light frames, and the apply global. When that is finished, I will double check one more time to see. And now I have my calibrated light frames all in one folder. I have 91 in total for all of my 3 filters. So let me show you just a quick comparison. We're going to open up one not calibrated and one calibrated. We're taking 2751 for the calibrated light frame, and we're taking 2751 for the not calibrated, and I'm going to stretch this. Now this is the original light frame, no calibration applied whatsoever. And here you can see that we have some amp glow up here. And we're going to stretch the calibrated image. And as you can see that there are no amp glow whatsoever. And we also have a bit of a cleanup, I would say, on this frame. So that's the reason of taking calibration frames. That was it for the PixInsight tutorial part 1. I will see you in the part 2. Thank you so much for watching this video and my PixInsight tutorial series. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, and if you have any requests on upcoming content, please leave a comment. Until the next time, I wish you have some clear skies.